let me start by asking you just sort of how there's a common thread between what we're seeing in Asia and, again, that message of increased defense spending that you're conveying to European allies. How is this part and parcel of a larger kind of foreign policy perspective that the president has?
Yeah, well, first it started with Donald Trump being elected last November and saying early on after his election that all of our allies, especially our NATO allies, needed to boost their spending to 5% of their gross domestic product. And by what we accomplished in June of this year at the NATO summit, we kind of set that as the benchmark now worldwide. I'm not sure we fully anticipated that. I'm sure Donald Trump thought about it, but now that is the benchmark, the 5% on defense spending. And, you know, the nice thing about the NATO alliance is it's the 32 countries, certainly, that are members, but we have partners all over the world, including our Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and they are great on the interoperability, on the standards that we set for munitions and weapons. And so it's sort of being inculcated across all U.S. allies. And this is really good news, not only for the strength of the United States and our alliances, but it's also good for our weapons and defense industry, but it's also good for all of our allies, because that strength is going to allow all of us to project power and, you know, and obviously address any threats, whether it's, you know, the Chinese threat, whether it's the Russian threat, or whether it's other threats that are maybe not as symmetrical.
Mr. Ambassador, at the last meeting of the NATO defense ministers, I heard you flag that some big pledges for Ukraine to purchase U.S. weapons. Can you tell us how much money we can expect to see spent on top of the $2 billion that Ukraine managed to secure by the end of last month, by the end of September?
Yeah, well, so right now we have set up a system where the commitments kind of are rolling forward. You know, we have probably another $2 billion or more to bring in the next several months, and we fully expect that that will be done here very soon. We have a foreign ministers meeting at the beginning of December, which will most likely kind of top that off. And then as we get into 2026, the key is sustainment. The key is the 12 or 15 billion dollars that are needed to buy the critical armaments needed by Ukraine to defend themselves and to continue this fight at the front line is going to be raised. It's going to be U.S. weapons, and you know, I'm confident about that. And I think this is another example of Europe stepping up, of our NATO allies here on the continent stepping up and supporting Ukraine in the defense, ultimately, of the European continent. And it's you know, we're watching very closely. Secretary Hegseth was very clear about that you know, President Trump is interested in the success of this since he announced it over the summer when I was there with him in the White House. And so it's a good news story, but, you know, our work is never done because this war continues. And that's, I think, the most important thing that President Trump has impressed on all of us, including our allies, is this war needs to end, and Russia needs to come to the table and resolve this dispute, resolve this war. They've made no progress in the last 3+ years of fighting. They still only control about 20% of Ukraine, and they're not, you know, going to accomplish much more, even if they continue to fight for years. And so the time is now to end this war.
It was a couple of days ago that the Treasury Department announced these new sanctions on Russian oil producers, and we've heard the president say publicly he hopes those sanctions won't be in place for very long. Given that, what can you tell us about how vigorously the U.S. is going to defend those sanctions?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, we have implemented those sanctions. We plan to enforce them. I think the president's point is very clear, is that we expect now, with these enormous sanctions that have been placed on Lukoil and Rosneft, that this will maybe be the thing to unlock President Putin coming to the table and ending this war, and at least entering into a ceasefire so we can, you know, negotiate a final resolution. But remember, as I've said before, President Trump holds all the cards. This is just one card that he's playing. There are many more. I was just today with CIA Director Ratcliffe here in Brussels, and we talked about a lot of other options that the president has available to him. And, you know, President Trump is going to play those as appropriate. But again, all we want is this war to end, and the killing to end, and the death and destruction, and to again have peace and prosperity. We have a peacemaker as president, and he's going to continue to work on this until he unlocks the right combination of leverage to get Vladimir Putin to agree to end the war.
You mentioned those cards, and I imagine a big one are these Tomahawk missiles. And you'll forgive me, but I just don't know what the state of play is on the U.S. being willing to give those to Ukraine now. What's your sense of how the president plans to deploy those or not?
Yeah, well, obviously that is ultimately President Trump's decision. You know, deep strike capabilities are not just available from the United States. There are other countries that are helping Ukraine that can provide those to be used on the battlefield. And we've already seen Ukraine developing its own, whether it's long-range drones or whether it's their Flamingo missile. There is all sorts of ways that long-distance strikes can be brought to the oil and gas infrastructure of Russia and their weapons and armaments manufacturing, no matter how far it may be behind the main line of contact. And so, you know, we're going to obviously keep some of those things close to the vest. President Trump is going to continue to look at whether Tomahawks are necessary or whether there are other opportunities for other countries to provide long-range strikes.
We see the European Union struggling to kind of come to an agreement on the use of frozen Russian central bank assets to back a loan to Ukraine. And I wonder sort of what the U.S.'s perspective on that is as you have conversations with European diplomats. Is the U.S. ready to kind of move in tandem with European nations to use those frozen Russian central bank assets to back a loan to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, what we really want is our European and NATO allies to move at the same time as the United States. In this case, we'd like the EU to move first. I mean, there's $140 billion that could be used to help Ukraine, whether it's on the battlefield or whether it's with their economy and with other needs that they have as a country. But, you know, this is an opportunity, really, and we've been encouraging the EU to make this move. We were disappointed that they didn't at this last meeting, but there's another meeting coming up in about a month where I think they'll have an opportunity. And they're just my observations from, you know, here in Brussels, it's across, you know, town, but is that they continue to try to make sure that they have all their pieces and parts lined up so that they can feel confident to make this move. Obviously, Belgium, where I'm sitting right now, has some concerns, but I think those will ultimately be resolved. And this would be another opportunity to bring Russia to the table, to negotiate and to resolve and end this war.
We've got about a minute left, and I want to ask you about the news that just broke that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has authorized powerful strikes on Gaza and certainly calls into question the integrity of the ceasefire that's been in place there. Of course, this isn't your remit specifically, but it does play into kind of foreign policy and international politics more generally. How are you thinking about the path forward here, the fragility of that ceasefire and what it means for stability in the region? Yeah,
well, we obviously were very proud that President Trump was able to make this historic ceasefire. Always knew that it was going to be fragile, always knew that Hamas has been a problem and could continue to be a problem, and we'll just have to watch it. You know, I know that one of the things that we were able to do in these negotiations was bring a lot of the Muslim world, a lot of the Middle East and the Gulf countries together to put pressure on Hamas to enter into this. We got, you know, all the living hostages were returned home, and that was obviously a very important moment in this dispute and this war. But we'll just have to watch it. I think, you know, the people of Gaza want peace. It's only Hamas that is the problem. And so, you know, Israel has certainly a right to defend itself, and we'll just have to see what additional pressure and additional opportunities the world can bring to make sure that Hamas is not hostile and doesn't continue to, you know, wreak havoc in the Gaza Strip.